Mind's Eye is actually an integration of a few different frameworks and tools. And because we are building a web application here, the framework I've used is the Flask framework. And as you guys know, Flask uses HTML and CSS for front-end installing, which is what I've also used here as well. And then I use this tool called ngrok to expose my local port to the public. And yes, it is pronounced as ngrok, not ngrok, so don't go crazy on me. And then we move on to the star of the show, which is the image generation model itself. I actually use a pre-trained model called VQGAN plus clip, which is short for Vector Quantized Generative Adversarial Network and Contrastive Language Image Pre-training. It sounds very fancy, but essentially this model takes in a string of words as an input and spits out an image as an output. The traditional way VQGAN plus clip is used is that the user themselves will pass an input into the model. So for example, if I want to see a dragon in a flower field, I might type in dragon, flower fields. But that is not what I wanted to achieve. I wanted a one-click image generation algorithm. In order to achieve that, I had to create my own input function, and I used this Python package called random word to help me to do so. More about that later. And because we're dealing with image generation and deep learning tasks, all of these are really computationally intensive, and I don't have a server in my house, so I hosted everything on Google Colab. As you guys know, Google Colab has this really unique feature where it allows us to leverage on Google's GPU to help us do all of these resource-intensive tasks. In order to use Google Colab, of course, you need a Google account, and we'll also be using Google Drive to perform some of the file manipulation here and there with web development, because as you know, especially for Flask, some of the folder structures and directories need to be very specific. So the first thing you want to do is to make sure that your runtime is set to GPU. Once that is done, you'll realize that there are three main parts to Mind's Eye. First is setting up the environment for the web application. Second is to create the image generation model itself, as well as the custom input function. Last but not least is to build the web application itself. Starting with setting up the environment, the very first thing that you need to do is to mount your Google Drive to the Google Colab notebook. This is the very first thing that you need to do because you want everything else that you'll be doing subsequently to be in your own Google Drive environment. Next is to set up your Flask and ngrok environment. And the thing to note here is that in order to use Flask and ngrok together at the same time, other than installing their own individual modules and packages, you will also need to install this module called Flask ngrok. This is just simply a package that will help you to integrate these two tools together. The next step is to authenticate your ngrok processes, and this is done by using your personal authentication ngrok token. You can obtain this by signing up and creating a free ngrok account. Once that is done, then we can go into the image generation model. You need to obviously install the packages, modules, and the dependencies for it to work. And this whole chunk of code is basically doing that. We can then start creating our input function. So over here again, I'm using the Python package random word. Some of the more interesting parameters in this function are what kind of parts of speech to include and exclude. The general idea here is that we want to give something concrete for the model to work with. So we're excluding things like conjunctions. So these are words like but, if, and, because how do you visualize but? How do you visualize if? How do you visualize and? On the flip side, we're including things like adjectives, so descriptive words and verbs like running, jumping. These words are much easier to visualize, and so that the general idea here again is to give something concrete for the model to work with. The other parameter is specifying the number of words that this input function will return. I find that between 3 to 10 words is a really nice number, because anything less than 3 words, for example, if you only have 1 word, it is really hard for the model to introduce randomness and create an abstract image. Anything more than 10 words, it becomes really hard for the model to wrap its head around what it's trying to create. In my experimentation, between 3 to 10 words is a comfortable range. So now we can go into creating the image generation function itself. Some of the more interesting parameters are things like the quality of the image, the aspect ratio of the image, the draw of the image, which will determine kind of the art style of the image, and the resolution of the image, as well as the number of iterations. As you can imagine, the higher the amount of iterations, the more detailed the image will be. At this juncture, it is important to note that for the purposes of Mind's Eye, we are focusing on the speed of the model rather than how detailed or how nice the image is. And this is again going back to our objective of trying to help artists to find inspiration for their next art piece. So abstract images are not only okay, it is actually what we are trying to achieve, because we want the artists to inject their own personality and flair into whatever they are creating. So even though this model is capable of creating amazingly detailed, beautiful, completed artworks, such as this or this or this, these artworks can take upwards of 20 minutes to generate, and so that's not what we're trying to achieve. It doesn't make sense for a user to be sitting at their computer for 20 minutes. So I have tweaked the model parameters accordingly based on what we're trying to achieve. Again, we are emphasizing on speed here. So once we have created the generator function, then we can move on to actually building the web application. At this juncture, I think it's easier for me to run the app itself and bring you through what is happening. Once I run it, you can see that ngrok has generated a link. So this is a public link, meaning that if I were to take this link and I were to copy it and paste it in any browser, I'll send it to my friends and family. They'll be able to access it as well, as long as this piece of code is running. So what are we actually doing here? How is it actually rendering this? So you can see that once the app starts, right, we are telling it to render this file called index.html, and index.html is right over here. You can see some of the CSS and the what kind of background image I'm using, but that's not the important part. The important part is this challenge me button. So this challenge me button is done by this piece of code over here. Once I click this challenge me button, this is going to come into this piece of code here. And if you button, if you challenge me or generate an image, you say pass. What is happening over here is that it is actually calling the custom input function that we have created earlier and assigning it to this variable. Over here, we're calling the generator model and using the output of our custom input function as the input for the generator model function, and then assigning the output to this output variable, which is essentially it'll be an image lah. Once all the functions have completed and finished running, right, we're asking the app to render this after.html template. And so over here you can see, because I clicked the button just now, it is generating the image. So another thing to note, in the generator model function, right, there's this parameter called display every. Over here, I specified that for every 20 iterations, I want to see how the image looks like, which is what we're seeing here lah. The model will also show you what kind of loss function it is using. In this case, it is using hinge loss to generate the image, and you also see the prompt that is being generated from. So curate marvelously. The biddiness, I don't know what that means, but yeah, you can see it slowly being generated. So while that is generating, for index.html, this cute little cat is being done by this piece of code here, as well as this piece of code here. So this is quite interesting. I'm not sure, am I seeing a person being formed as the iterations go by? I'm not really sure. Maybe that's the curate part of the prompt, maybe like it's a person standing there looking at different art pieces. It's about done. Once the model is finished running, you'll auto load after.html, which is over here. So again, once the model is finished running, it will load after.html. For after HTML, you'll notice that there are two buttons instead of one, and at the same time, we also want to show the generated image. So this is the piece of code that is showing the generated image. This is the code for the generate another image button. This piece of code allows us to show that cute little kitty when we click on this specific button. And then the home button simply just redirects us to the home page. So if I click on generate another image, you can see the cute little kitty doing its thing, and consequently over here you can see that the code is generating another image. So you can see that now the prompt that it's using is middle words call Cremona lib ragging collected and Scrivener. You can see the randomness come into play because the previous prompt was 3 words and now we have 8 words. And let's see how it looks like. And that is how I created Mind's Eye, and thank you for watching.